a special episode, Discussions with Dezzi. I'm your host, Dezzi, and we have our special guest today. She is the San Angelo's NAACP chapter president, Miss Sherley Spears.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good, and I'm so glad to be here with you, Destiny. I'm just really excited. Thank you for inviting me.
So to get started, can you just give a quick introduction about yourself?
Okay, so I'm originally from Fort Worth, Texas. Grew up in a relatively small family on the south side of Fort Worth. My mother and father raised us until he passed away. We were very young. My mother continued to be responsible and a wonderful mother to raise us all. We grew up during the civil rights movement in the late 50s, early 60s, and my mother was a staunch advocate for education and just being informed. She made us learn so many things as a young child, to appreciate the way she reared me and my two other sisters. My brother was already a part of the U.S. military as part of the Air Force. And so there were the three girls, and mother used to always refer to us as her girls because it was the three of us and we did everything together. We're all just a couple of years apart. Fortunately for me, I was the baby. And so while some people say I was spoiled, I may have been. But I benefited from having two older sisters and a mother, instilled honesty, integrity, the need to be involved in what was going on around you. Back then we didn't have options like we have today where you could just turn on something and there's the news, or get on Facebook and that type thing. So we had to read the newspaper. During that time, it was a lot of things going on with the civil rights movement. And so certainly there were discussions that were held at the kitchen table. And so I guess I like to say that all of the life lessons that have brought me to where I am today, many of them I learned at the kitchen table, talking to my sisters and my mother about different things that were going on. If there was an opportunity for something to be on the news, particularly with things that were going on with the movement with Dr. King, we were able to watch that on TV, but that was a privilege. You could see that little short clip, whatever may have been on TV, because they didn't cover anything except all of the negative stuff that was going on. So I remember learning about Black history, the importance of being strong and being firm in our belief system, being honest and true to ourselves and to our community. It was extremely important. So where I grew up in a segregated world, I would see my teachers at the grocery store and at church on Sunday, and during the week, they may be a member of my choir and that type of thing. And so they instilled those important values of understanding what was going on, making sure that we were equipped, telling us history, providing us history, supporting us, getting us to help them as adults and things that we needed to do. So I tell people I've been a part of the movement per se for a number of years. My part in the movement was not like some of the older kids who were involved in the movement, certainly because I was just a young girl. But those had profound effect on what I became, who I became, how I approach things, because I understand the value of being a proud African-American woman.
And do you believe that you talked about these values being instilled in you and wanting to express what it means to be educated, what it means to stand up in that world? Do you think that's what your driving force is today as the NAACP president within San Angelo?
Yeah, I think so. My mother was a very strong woman, the strongest woman I've ever known. And even though she was limited in her ability to exist freely in this country, and certainly in our community, she was just very strong and always very thoughtful, always had a vision, and that passed down, and she trained us. And so in addition to that, we had a lot of community things going on back then. And so my mentor in the community was a lady named Irma Duffy Lewis. And I grew up in the YWCA back then. You know, the YWCA was one of those first organizations that welcomed diversity. There were several other advisors who worked with Ms. Lewis, but she was the one who was in charge of our activities on a regular basis. And she had a footprint all over the city for African-American girls in particular. We were exposed to things like economics. We were exposed to things like being able to read, understanding history, reading poetry, knowing the celebrities in the Black community, in the global space back then. And so it was always about educating yourself being strong, knowing what you were talking about, being passionate for yourself, because back then they told us you're not only representing yourself, representing your family, and you're representing all of the colored community. And so it was important for us to understand that. And so we did that. So even when people didn't realize they needed to change, it was something that we were taught to help identify the change that was needed and then to help move to that point and get to that destination.
So what would you say has been your vision? What has been your mission? And speak a little bit on the events that you have done and if that fulfilled your vision and where you want to continue going.
For the last few years, we've been doing a lot of new things. The NAACP is the oldest, and as they say, oldest and boldest civil rights organization in the country. We've been around since 1909. One of our founding members was W.E.B. Du Bois, who was instrumental in getting the Niagara movement documented and started. And so some of the values and information that we learned from the Niagara movement are the basis for some of the things that we have established as the NAACP. We are trying to connect with the community in ways that we've not connected before. In my administration since last January, our theme has been shifting. What we're trying to do is to engage in matters that affect the African American community, but have an understanding of the leadership in the city so that we will know how to effectively engage in any of those discussions. So, for instance, last January, I guess that was the first event that we had done in this administration. That was to bring one of the survivors from the 16th Street church bombing. We were able to bring Ms. Collins, and that was a wonderful event with great remarks and speaking points, and we had a diverse group of community. The point of that was to celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday. And so we had an international speaker, Ms. Collins, to come and talk to us. And then we moved into one of our traditional events in February, which was the Freedom Fund Banquet that we had recently renamed in honor of our local founder, Mr. L.A. Rabin. That event is something that we've done for many years. The goal of it is to raise funds so that we can give out scholarships to students. And so we started the year off with that, and then we had an event in March to celebrate the women in our community. You know, Dezzi, oftentimes when we look at celebrations in a small community such as in San Angelo, we seem to always reach for the national celebrity. One of my key points is that we cannot overlook the work that has been done here in this community for years and years. We have a lot of people who certainly came before me, some who are still here, some who have passed on, who have done great things in the city of San Angelo. And one of the goals that I had was to embrace those great things that they've done from people right here in San Angelo. I think we get a global perspective, beyond San Angelo oftentimes. And while there are some issues that are going on now, we certainly need to understand, which is another venture that we're dealing with, our criminal justice restorative plan. But we need to take a moment, I think, and just say thank you to our ancestors, our leaders, done things in our community. For instance, our founder, L.A. Rabin, was involved heavily with the integration of schools here in San Angelo in 1955. So people say, oh, well, we integrated early, and that's great, but the details that are involved there with what Mr. Rabin had to do, what he had to say, how he had to perform, those are the types of things I want us to key in on. There have been several issues that are racially motivated that have happened over the last many, many years, way before I relocated here. But somehow we seem to lose some of those details. And that's what I want us to take a moment and remember, are those details about the people, the local people, not just our great history with the Buffalo Soldiers that we're so proud of, which is an important aspect of our history, because many of the Buffalo Soldiers who lived at Fort Concho were involved in our community greatly. We had our first African-American church was started by a Buffalo Soldier, Mr. J.W. Walker. Make sure that we're recalling before a lot of our elders are no longer here to fill in those blanks. And that's what I want us to do. And all of them, you can't tell me that all of them don't have some impact on civil rights, because, we weren't able to vote until the 60s. And so a lot of the things that were being pressed for here were based on the need to have it for the colored, Negro, Black, African American community. And so I know it all ties in to being able to have some rights as African Americans. And unfortunately, many of us take that for granted today, I think, and I've seen a return in the last couple of years where we have African Americans who turn on the ones who are trying to do things of value. And so we need to be mindful that we are no longer on the plantation, as I like to say, and we need to provide support for our young and old. And so there are things that we need to learn and things that we need to share generationally to help us get to the best African American community that we can be in San Angelo.
And for our viewers, I've only been in San Angelo for a couple of years, but what she's speaking on is so important. I believe in one of my projects through the West Texas Collections, there's so much history. If you didn't know, back in the 1970s with Miss Sandra Gray, that was the first time an African-American teacher taught at Lakeview. This is the 70s we're talking about, everyone. This is not going back to the 60s or 50s, going back beyond that. And we need to take the time to reflect on those figures. Even Mr. J.B. Hall, he was the first constable African-American to hold a county position. This was less than 50 years ago. So I just want to take the time so everyone can reflect on that and know that.
Yeah, if I could just kind of also add, Miss Gray certainly was the first African-American teacher at Lakeview. As we're talking about connecting and getting the history together, we certainly applaud Miss Gray, and she has done some great things. But I also want to recall Mary Butler Owens, who was the first African-American teacher here in the San Angelo area of note. She wasn't the first African-American teacher, but she was the first one of note. And she just died here recently in the last couple of years, and she did some great things with our students. And we have Miss Levert from over at Dunbar Library, which was the African-American or Black library, who did some wonderful things and inspired and motivated a whole generation of people. And then you have others, like you mentioned, Mr. Hall, who we lost on May 2nd this year, who was involved and elected. And it's important to note that election so that no one thinks it was appointed. He was elected as the first African-American constable here in Tom Green County, well respected by many, disliked by many, because he was always trying to make sure that he was doing the right thing, that he was empowering the African-American community, engaging us on the political aspects of our lives, voting, as we are in this season of voting. I think of him often because we're now trying to fill some very large shoes to get his particular precinct that he served as a precinct chair for years, Precinct 1. This is very important. And I know that he had already given some instructions, for instance, of what we need to do in this cycle. And so we will do our best to deliver those things that we had already talked about. Starting later this month, we're going to have a town hall to talk about the candidates. So yes, there are a lot of things that are going on here. We have a gentleman here from our community. While it wasn't in San Angelo, it was close enough. He was the first African-American postmaster in Ballinger, and he is a former president of the San Angelo NAACP. We have a lot of firsts that we seem to just kind of push aside. And then one of the things that concerns me is that when attention is brought to some of these wonderful things, there seems to be, some concern about, well, this person needs it and that person deserves it. And you have to look at starting. We can't acknowledge and recognize everyone at one time. That's part of what we're trying to do, is establish that connection. We had first African-American city council person who was also past president of the NAACP, and we've had others. We currently have one African-American woman on the city council. And so these are things that are important for us to connect with and highlight and celebrate these accomplishments, because here we are in 2020 and we're still having first, but we have to continue to have first until we have multiple elections, multiple appointments of African Americans being able to have their footprint all over this city.
I completely agree with that. And in accordance with this, we're going to kind of transition.
Okay.
We're going to try to transition to what's going on today. What is your perspective? Do you consider another modern civil rights movement, as we've seen with Ahmaud Arbery, as we've seen with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor? What is your perspective on the current events?